Uh, don't guillotine me.
Jeez.
Don't discard me.
All right,
Hi.
shut up. Hey,
Hey, shut up.
no, you shut
That's
up.
a great way to start the show.
No, you shut
Hey,
up.
shut up. No, you shut up. Okay. Calling Chris Anderson in Windsor.
I am in Windsor. Yes, I'm in Studio W2 this evening because
Dun, 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 dun. Studio W2 coming to you from Windsor, UK.
yeah, it's because my daughter's in Studio W1, aka my office. So, but you look like you're in Chicago too.
I'm in Chicago in the same old place, and happy to be here. It's going to be my last show in Chicago for a while, because I'll be on the road for the next 4 weeks. Welcome everybody to History Happy Hour. Wow, it's already tough. It's tough.
It's already tough crowd.
Thanks to Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours for helping to bring you this show. And check out their rich offering of military history tours at StephenAmbroseTours.com, including the Ghost Army Tour. Chris, we have to mention that. We're a little short on people for the tour this fall. So if we don't get a few more people, I'm afraid it'll get canceled. I know you would just delight in that.
I would want to be canceled. Okay. I just would want you to be, I don't know, moving on.
Okay. Whether you're watching live, watching on replay, or listening on the HHH podcast. Yes. We're glad you're here. And today we'll be talking about D-Day landing craft. Before we do that, Chris, we should thank everyone who supports us on Patreon. We got a new Patreon supporter just a day or two ago. Not a top shelf supporter, but nonetheless a new supporter. We appreciate that.
Absolutely.
And you can join either as a top shelf supporter or on one of the other shelves at patreon.com/history happy hour. So that's how you become a top shelf patron. Chris, I was just thinking, I'm leading this D-Day to the Rhine tour starting a week from tomorrow. So so do you have a favorite out of the way, most people don't go there, top secret place that you would like before live studio audience to tell me?
Why would I tell you that? Why would I tell you that?
I don't know, because we're close friends, we're good buddies, we work together, we're colleagues.
But I don't do the D-Day to the Rhine tour.
Yeah, fine. You're chipping it.
No, you kind of got me on the spot here. Let me give it some time.
Oh no, I was just trying to make conversation.
Oh, I like to go to the spot where that photograph of Eisenhower, is it Eisenhower, Bradley? Is it Churchill in the picture? But with the Siegfried Line picture when they got up to the Siegfried Line?
Oh, okay. All right. I'll have to get on with you later to find out where that is.
Yeah, we'll see now that we can.
If you'll tell me. Meantime. Maybe. Meantime, what do we got? We have anybody watching, or are we just doing this for ourselves?
We've got Homer's back. Homer's Hodge from Fairfax, Virginia. So I'm really happy to see Homer back. Ken is back from Paris. So Ken, at some point, I need to get the full report, see how that went. Liz Mumford again is joining us from a sunny and 70 Ocean City, Maryland.
Well, I see Skip Esty is here, and Frank Cook, and Dave Borland is drinking a tawny port.
Very good.
Nice, Dave. All right. I doubt it. He's a pure fellow. So why don't you give us a cue? We'll get started here, Chris. I didn't find the bell.
Oh man! All week. That's the one thing you have to do.
No, I don't. If I find it later on in the show, I'll ring it then. Okay, right. The bar is open.
Okay, thank you.
On June 6, 1944, 4,126. That's not an exact number. A specially designed landing craft carried 132,000 Allied troops to the D-Day beaches. And today, we're going to take a deep dive into why so many different types of landing craft were built, how they were built, how well they did in the hour of crisis. Our guest is Andrew Whitmarsh, who's the author of the book D-Day Landing Craft. Andrew's been the curator of the D-Day Story Museum in Portsmouth for more than 20 years. That museum is home to the last surviving intact LCT, landing craft tank. He is also the author of Portsmouth at War and D-Day in Photographs welcome and thank you for joining us, Andrew Whitmarsh.
Thanks, Rick and Chris. It's great to be here. Thank you.
Oh, thanks for joining us.
Despite all the crises that are happening.
Well, I saw him get up. I looked like he was in the studio.
I was starting to feel worried whether it would happen at all, but I'm glad we made it at this point.
I know, without the bell. There we go. It's about damn.
Just got the bell. Okay, found the bell. Did you bring a cocktail, Andrew, to help you through this? Have you finished it yet?
Brought a small whiskey, which is partly because of being on holiday to Scotland recently, but I could claim that it's also a nod to the many Scottish landing craft related connections.
Is it a single malt?
Yes, I think so. Yeah.
What single malt is it?
I'm not a whiskey expert. It's a Speyside Trutina.
Okay. Speyside.
All right. Report.
Chris, what do you got?
Scottish Connection, Glenturret 12.
Excellent. I'm drinking a haphazard beer.
Out of your PsyOps glass, Rick?
Yes, I am, out of my PsyOps glass. Now, usually when one person introduces the guest, that same person asks the first question. But in a last-minute story conference, 30 seconds before we went on the air, we decided to split that duty. So, Mr. Anderson, you get to start it off.
All right. So, at the start of the book, you have a quote from a Commander Rupert Curtis, DSC, RNVR, in which he says, "Without the work of the landing ships and craft, victory would not have been possible. Naturally, the Blue Water School of the Royal Navy found it very hard, with certain honorable exceptions, to endure the existence of such strange newcomers among the King's ships. Not only were the landing craft ugly and unorthodox, they were manned largely by hurriedly trained hostilities-only ratings commanded by RNVR officers who, by training and tradition, or lack thereof, were sometimes as unorthodox as the craft they commanded." So usually when we hear about D-Day, obviously the focus is on the men that are landing. Sometimes, very rarely, we hear about the ships offshore. But all of these other craft that Curtis is talking about, they're sort of in the background. So why did you bring them to the foreground in this story? What did you think needed to be said?
Well, really, because I thought they were an essential part of the story and an overlooked part of the story. Obviously, the first question someone could ask is, well, do we really need another book on D-Day? Because there have been quite a few written already.
Right. I asked that question last week, in fact.
As your groaning bookshelves may tell you. But I thought it was a topic that's been overlooked. And I often think of, inevitably mentioning Saving Private Ryan, but the kind of perspective that you get in the opening minutes of the film. Landing craft feature briefly, but then the troops go ashore, and then the focus is all on the troops ashore, and no one really explains, or no one really thinks about how do successive other waves of troops arrive, how are they, all the stores they need, how are they arriving, what's actually going on out at sea. The focus is very much looking inland, and I use that quote or the ugly and unorthodox part of that quote in my book, in the subtitle of the book. Partly because I wanted to have the words of someone who was actually involved in landing craft, who served on landing craft, rather than me making up something. And I like the way that he, in the quote you just read out, he talks about both the landing craft themselves being seen by the rest of the Navy as really quite a sort of lesser class of than the sort of proper warships, but also he talks about the crews and refers to how a lot of the crews were not peacetime sailors, not professional sailors, but had been brought in, given very brief training, and then had to get on with the job. And I did actually want to call the whole book, title the book "Ugly and Unorthodox," because I thought that I was looking along a bookshelf in a shop and I saw a book called Ugly and Unorthodox. I'd want to know what that was, but the publishers were probably right that it's best to have a title that says what the book's actually about.
I don't know. Maybe, I like that.
Yeah, maybe I'll steal that as the title for my memoir. World War II sees a mind-blowing variety of landing craft developed, from the LCVPs that held 30 people, to the LST, not technically a landing craft, but a landing ship that holds hundreds of feet long and holds hundreds of soldiers. There's landing craft for tanks. There's landing craft for radio control. All this different stuff. And how does this development happen? I mean, is there a light goes on one day and people say we're going to need a whole crap load of landing craft, or is it sort of a more gradual development that becomes more clear to people over time?
Before I'd really looked at this question and this whole subject in detail, I kind of assumed that because D-Day was acknowledged at the time as such an important operation, or from the Western Allied perspective, maybe the important operation, although that's obviously arguable, but one of the most important operations of the war. And because it had been looked at, anticipated for so long and planned for so long, I guess as I say, before I'd really looked into it in detail, I kind of assumed that there'd been, at some point quite early on, someone had sat down and say, what are the types of landing craft we need? Okay, what's the best way of building them? And let's work towards assembling that fleet of landing craft that's needed for this landing that would become D-Day. But actually, it was much more a case of almost making it up as you go along. Many of the types of landing craft that were used on D-Day were actually developed during the war itself. So obviously, only a few years ahead of D-Day. Sometimes they went through a couple of different types or variants before they got to the ones used on D-Day. But really, there was very little. There wasn't a long time for development, so they were experimenting as they were developing the craft, and sometimes they had to make do with landing craft that were sort of the previous generation, effectively. Sometimes those older landing craft got put into a role that wasn't so much in the assault, but was more in support, for example. But it was very much a case of as the sort of successive waves of, as the landings got closer, as the date for D-Day got closer, the Allies really scrabbling around to try and find as many landing craft as possible. And that question, the whole matter of trying to find enough landing craft that is part of the story of D-Day, as is often told. But again, a thing that really struck me working on the book is when you hear about the Allied commanders, for example, worrying about how they get enough landing craft, it's like it's some kind of natural phenomenon. It's like it's something that's entirely out of their control. To get enough landing craft assembled in the UK for use on D-Day and after D-Day, but actually it's very much something in the Allies' control, and the shortages and all the scrabbling around for enough landing craft in the months leading up to D-Day are a result of decisions taken by the Allies, not necessarily by the commanders who were commanding the D-Day forces, the Normandy forces, sometimes by more senior commanders and leaders, but they were the result of decisions they'd taken.
So, Andrew, I mean, kind of picking up on that idea, the other thing that really struck me with the book is, well, two things. One is just the complexity of some of this stuff, the building it, the deploying it, all those sorts of things, but also just the numbers involved. So in terms of money, material, and manpower, what sort of size or scope of a thing are we looking at here? I mean, how many men are just to build them, to create this fleet? I mean, how big a commitment is this on the part of the Allies?
I'm not sure of an exact number, but it must have been into the hundreds of thousands.
Right. So I know in the book you have a wonderful reference to, at one point, the landing craft production has the same priority as the Manhattan Project, which that completely blew me away.
Yeah, when I found that in a wartime report, I was completely amazed. And actually, that is really a reflection of the Allies suddenly realizing that they almost haven't got their act together, and so they're having to resort to such desperate measures to in the month, literally the last few months before D-Day, to build enough landing craft. And so it's quite a short period when that is the case, when it's landing craft have an equal priority to the Manhattan Project, which is obviously the developing the atomic bomb. But yeah, it really did strike me. But to come back to the question of the number of people, it partly depends on what you class as a landing craft, which we can go into in a moment if you like.
Yeah, I think we should.
But if we include landing ships like the LST, the landing ship tank, for example, which was essentially a 2-deck ship that could carry about 20 or so tanks. And yeah, so here we've got a nice photo one. So the vehicles emerging from it are on the lower deck, the tank deck, and then the upper deck, which you can see some crewmen looking out on the scene from. You could have lighter vehicles on that top deck, and so these officially weren't landing craft, but they're often lumped in with them at the time, and they're very much part of the story. So that's why I covered them as well. Sorry, where I was going with that is the LSTs, for example, were built at sites all across the US, and there's I can think of one particular site, for example, that had 20,000 workers at it who actually were in 3 shifts, so they were working round the clock. And so that's just one site building LSTs, and there were I forget the exact number, but it's got to be more than 10, maybe more like 15 sites that built LSTs that were used at Normandy, and that's only one type of landing ship or landing craft involved. So there were lots of different landing craft built in the US, and also many built in the UK. But really, I think the whole question of where and how they were built and designed is another really interesting part of the story. And so from the British point of view, it very much relied on American production, but equally there were large numbers of British landing craft as well. So it very much was a sort of inter-allied cooperation. And you mentioned LCT 7074, which is at the place where I work, the D-Day story. And I should, as that comes up, I should mention I wrote the book in my own time, so it's related, but not directly associated with the museum.
The museum is not responsible for anything that Mr. Whitmarsh put in his book and denies any connection with it. Right? Something along those lines.
But the shop does sell my book, so they haven't entirely cut ties. So that particular LCT, so it was a British design, but it was again in the final months leading up to D-Day, at the start of 1944, when the British were looking for ways of getting just a few more. So there's a nice photo of her. A few more ways of getting a few more landing craft built, and most British most British LCTs, landing craft tanks, weren't built by kind of bigger shipbuilders, because those shipbuilders were generally trying to churn out warships or merchant ships. Most of British LCTs were built by engineering companies who in peacetime built things like bridges, but they were used to working with steel. But 7074 was built by a sort of regular shipbuilder. But so in the UK we could build the hull, but what we couldn't source was the engine. So there were about 70 or so LCTs like this, including LCT 7074, where they had British hulls, but then they had US engines. So that was, in one single landing craft, it exemplifies that Anglo-American cooperation. But there's lots of other Anglo-American connections. Like, for example, there's a number of types of landing craft, or for example, the LCIL landing craft infantry large, or the LST as well, which start off as a British request or concept, and then actually get designed and built in the US. So it's very much a matter of cooperation.
So let me just pick up on what you've been saying, Andrew, and maybe this could help a bit. how many LSTs do the Americans have in 1940? And then how many do they have in 1944? Do you have those numbers to hand, or is that?
I might not have the exact numbers, but in 1940 they don't have any,
Right.
because it's
Doesn't exist yet.
yeah, it's the yeah, it was a concept that was still being developed. I'll see if I can quickly find the exact date, but it doesn't matter too much.
We should play the Jeopardy theme now while he's looking. Just to
Sorry, Andrew. Sorry.
We're going to fill the time a little bit and kind of put a little pressure on. Dun 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 dun.
So,
okay.
Yeah. So it would have been 1941, 42 when the LSTs, the concept is being developed,
right,
essentially, and the first LSTs of the type used at Normandy were ready in September 1942, and then at Normandy there were 236 LSTs,
and probably at least twice that many in other places at that point, right? I mean, because they've got them in the Pacific and Italy and North Africa.
Yes, absolutely, and you obviously with the distances in the Pacific, which are much greater than crossing the English Channel. An LST, being a large ocean-going ship that can carry a substantial number of vehicles, is, you can see the importance of an LST to the Pacific. So that was why one of many reasons why so many were used out there as well. So, like I was saying, it's over a matter of just a few years, this particular type of landing ship is developed. The design is, someone comes up with a design. A US designer, places are found for them to build. I mean, even just finding a place like which wouldn't have been generally wouldn't have been an existing shipyard.
right.
A lot of them were known as I think it was cornfield shipyards, if I remember the expression right. Anyway, but basically because it would have been a site.
Right, you're talking about in the U.S. that they built LSTs in Evansville, Indiana, Seneca, Illinois. They built submarines in Manitowoc, Wisconsin. None of these towns are near an ocean. You'll note. So they've got to go hundreds of miles on the Illinois River, the Missouri River, the Mississippi River, the Ohio River, anyway, to get down to New Orleans, and then they can go either way, Atlantic or Pacific. And that's, I've heard the expression cornfield shipyards and cornfield navy. And I'm fascinated by that. And some of the places where these ships are going through, there's locks in the Illinois River, and the LST fits like by about that much. I mean, it just barely fits into those locks, but it does. And so I can just imagine kids sitting there watching in 1943 and just LST after LST are going down the river, going down to head out to war. So, okay, that wasn't a question. So,
you gonna let our guest talk now?
No. Oh, did you want to ask another question, Chris?
No, I asked two.
I asked two.
So
all right. So, I wanted to know, before we get into acronym hell with all the different landing craft, I would like to know to what degree. I think a lot of people might be interested in this. To what degree do FDR and Winston Churchill and Dwight Eisenhower, just to pick three names, get personally involved in the development of landing craft? I know there's a famous Churchill quote about, entire fate of two empires is, wrapped up in some damn thing called an LST or something along those lines. But to what degree do they personally have to enter into it and separate for us myth from reality here?
So they're all of those men, and many sort of similar. They're right at the very top of the Allied armed forces. Were regularly talking detail about landing craft and LSTs, things like that. Not so much necessarily about the very much the details of the manufacture and design, but sometimes that did come up as well. Like I mentioned about sourcing engines, for example, there were some difficulties like that had to be overcome. But if you look at, for example, the records of the British War Cabinet, so that the very highest political group of politicians directing the war, landing craft get mentioned, and LSTs get mentioned regularly in that. So it's not just a passing mention; it's something that all of these men right at the top are regularly spending considerable amount of time on, and there's and it's the same in the US as well, which is kind of ridiculous in some ways, because you'd think, like, everyone's agreed, the Allies have, or the British and the Americans have agreed, once the US comes into the war, that there's a policy of Germany first. So okay, we're going to focus on dealing with Nazism first, and then turn to the Pacific. That's the theory, and then it should be, in theory, it should be just a case of allocating enough money so that all the different people involved can design and then build the landing craft, and then just kind of let the top politicians know when it's all done. But so the fact that they're having to regularly discuss and sort of scrimp around to try and find enough landing craft and LSTs is quite surprising to me, really, when you think about it. But actually, it's a problem of their own making, because the politicians, and it's not entirely, I'm not sort of blaming the politicians, but the politicians essentially take a series of decisions, and you could go right back to the end of 1942, or getting on towards the end of 1942, when the Allies decide on Operation Torch to land in North Africa. That uses landing craft that in theory could have been put by and held back for D-Day, but the problem was that D-Day wasn't looking like it was going to come along anytime soon. And from a political point of view, thinking of the domestic audiences in both countries, the US and the UK, amongst other places, it wasn't really politically acceptable for the Allies to be seen to be building up this big force that wasn't kind of pulling its weight, wasn't doing anything. So so a large proportion of these forces, and also not just the landing craft, of course, but the troops who would have landed in them, get used in North Africa, and then that leads along to a whole series of campaigns in the Mediterranean, and then it's a kind of vicious circle, because that then means that effectively delays D-Day even more, because you've kind of used up through loss and wearing out a number of those landing craft and landing ships, and it's sort of reinforcing the problem that was there in the first place. There's not to say, of course, that it necessarily would have been better for the Allies to have an earlier D-Day in Normandy, because sort of slightly straying off topic, but obviously those intervening years gave them a chance to learn all sorts of things, including how to, from the landing craft point of view, how to land on enemy beaches, and some of the types of landing craft that were needed for that.
So, Andrew, I had a question I was going to ask you, but before I do, I thought I'd bring one in from Wally, who's one of our longtime viewers, and it's sort of along the lines of what we've been talking about. Put this up here. Wally wants to know, how did the Allies know what number of landing craft of all kinds was enough? Which I think is a pretty good question, since they've never done this before.
Yes, it is. In a sense, they didn't, or they couldn't agree, and there were actually moments when there were planners, for example, in the UK and then back in the US, who were both developing different plans for D-Day and the number of landing craft that would be involved, and they differed on how many landing craft they thought it took to land a particular unit of troops, like a division, for example. And actually, as one of the ways that the Allies do manage to find enough landing craft is by reducing the proportion of a division that they land, by reducing the number of vehicles that they land, in particular, in the assault, in the early stages of the landings. And actually, many units as well, you're not landing for example, if it's like, say, an infantry battalion or any other unit comparable to that, you're often not actually landing the entirety of that unit all in one go. Often there will be several different sort of proportions of the unit that were held back that could be used as reserves and reinforcements to replace casualties, and other reasons like that. So it's not actually quite as simple a question as it might first seem, because there was a kind of two-way relationship between the number of landing craft available, and which was changing as time went on, as more were built, as the date for D-Day changed, and so on, and also matching that number of the capacity of those landing craft to the troops that you wanted to land. So which troops were most important to land on D-Day or earlier on D-Day, and which could wait maybe a few days or even longer before they arrived in Normandy. So it's two interacting sets of calculations, and so hats off to the planners who are having to make all of these calculations and continually update it. And just to complicate it even more, there's a period of, I think, several months when, as is quite well known, when Eisenhower and Montgomery and the other Allied commanders were appointed around about the very end of 43, very start of 44, particularly the army, all the various army commanders, they look at the plans that are in existence and say which are for 3 divisions landing or 3 beaches, and say this isn't a large enough frontage of landings. The landings need to be much wider, and they went for 5 beaches in the end, just for a variety of reasons, but basically gave the Allies a better chance of getting a foothold in Normandy. It was harder for the Germans to sort of shut down a larger stretch of coastline, a larger number of landings. So, but this isn't an instant decision. So there's several months when the possibility of going from 3 to 5 beaches is being debated. So for all of that time, the planners are having to have several plans running concurrently for 3 beaches, 5 beaches, and possibly other things as well as constantly changing the numbers for how many landing craft they had available, etc.
Can't they just plug them into the computer and generate out a new? No. Apparently not. I want to remind everybody that we're chatting today with Andrew Whitmarsh, who is the author of D-Day Landing Craft, How 4,126 Ugly and Unorthodox Allied Craft Made the Normandy Landings Possible. Maybe we should, we promised this, so maybe we should give us what craft are we talking about? And you don't have to go into every single LC whatever, but give us
the book. It's all in there.
It's
with pictures and diagrams.
Yeah, lots of great pictures. Lots of pictures I had not seen before. So that was exciting. But give us a sense of what are, I don't know, maybe you can divide it into 5 categories. I don't know what you can do, but give us a sense of what are the landing craft involved in D-Day. And if you want any pictures, just let me know and I'll throw up a picture of something.
Great, thanks. Obviously it's impossible really to write the book without it becoming a bit of an alphabet soup of all the acronyms. That's just something that sadly people have to wade through potentially. But yeah, a wide variety of different landing craft. Perhaps you could start with a picture of the Samuel Chase, please, Rick.
Sure.
Thanks. So this is not a landing craft. From the British point of view, LSI landing ship infantry, or APA, or the various other designations, auxiliary personnel attack, that stood for from the US point of view. But basically a big troop carrying ship. But it's very much part of the story of landing craft, because you can maybe see in the picture that on the sides, partly on hanging from derricks suspended from the sides, and also on the deck of the ship, there's a number of different smaller landing craft. These are very smaller landing craft, generally didn't make the crossing to Normandy under their own power. They'd been carried on a larger ship like this. The US, probably most famous US landing craft of this sort of size is the LCVP landing craft vehicle personnel, or Higgins boat, and the British equivalent was the LCA, or landing craft assault. So they were excellent. Yeah. So you've got some in the foreground there. In this case, British landing craft, but carrying American troops, And just to make the point there that the landing craft crews were the main nationalities were British, American, and Canadian. There was a significant number of Canadian landing craft and crews as well. Obviously, lots of other individuals and lots of other nationalities as well. And the book does look at all of those nationalities together. So it's very much trying to capture the entire story of landing craft on D-Day. So those small landing craft were really important for particularly for the initial landings, because essentially when the enemy defences were still very active, having a larger number of small landing craft meant that your forces were more widely spread, and any that did come, well, in theory at least, any that did come under fire, there'd hopefully be many others that managed to get through the defences, and that was so that was why having a larger number of small landing craft was better than having just a smaller number of really big landing craft. But those bigger landing craft were also important, and the LCT, like so we saw LCT 7074, as in the photo here. So this is a British-built LCT. There were two main marks or variants of British-built LCTs, and there were also two main types to marks of US-built LCTs. So they had some slight variations in the dimensions and so on, but the main aspect of them was having a large tank deck, basically a large space that could carry lots of tanks or other vehicles. And so some of these LCTs actually landed in around about HAS at the very start of D-Day. So imagine what it would have been like from the German point of view, seeing this relatively massive target. So LCT 7074 there is 59 meters long, so they're really quite substantial. An LCT early on D-Day would be really quite a big target, and many of them did come under heavy fire. But they were then used throughout D-Day, as the rest of D-Day as well. And then perhaps if we go to the photo of Juno Beach, please. So here we've got an landing craft infantry large. One of the great things about landing craft is that generally they always have the initials, a acronym painted on the bows, so it makes it a bit easier for identification. So this is a Canadian landing craft landing Canadian troops on Juno, the Canadian beach. And yeah, just as I mentioned just now, not all of the landing craft here were Canadian, but there were many Canadian landing craft landing with Canadian and the British troops who also landed here. So this type of landing craft, so you only got to see the bow here, but you could see the ramp. So there was a ramp that was lowered either side of the LCIL's bow, which were quite vulnerable to damage from enemy fire, etc. And you see the troops coming down them, and then there's sailors have taken a rope ashore. You can maybe just about make out that there's a rope leading to the shore and the troops wading along. So this particular craft carried 200 men, so really quite a substantial number of troops that could be landed in one place by one landing craft. And that was actually that's one example of a British concept. But then the British realised they couldn't build these LCILs in the UK because they need to be built in steel, and the place that could do that was the US. So they're built in the US, and then that type of landing craft were used both by the Americans, by the British, and by the Canadians. So again, inter-allied cooperation. Then I haven't got a photo, but fire support landing craft of various different sizes. These are often existing landing craft or existing types that are modified. Anything from small types that could have had a number of mortars that could get quite close to the beach, or rockets, and fire them at the German defences shortly before the troops landed, up to LCTs, for example, that had guns, either destroyer-type guns, or perhaps the most famous one is the landing craft tank rocket, LCTR, which had about 1,000 rockets on its deck, and would fire them, not all at once, because that would probably have sunk the landing
And you've
craft
got a picture of that in
uncorrectly.
the book. So yeah, if
Mhm.
you want to see what that looks like, it's pretty incredible.
And that's something that the assault troops often mention. So if you ever, for example, read accounts by veterans of who landed fairly early on D-Day, they often mention the horrendous noise made by these rocket firing landing craft, which would have been firing over their heads, just because of the timings and the ranges. That was how it needed to be done to deliver the rockets relatively at the last minute before they landed. And then, so I mentioned the LST, and in the photo that we saw earlier, in the foreground, there was something called a Rhino ferry, which was essentially a large powered platform that was a way of unloading the LSTs. So it meant that so you'd unload onto the Rhino ferry a few miles out to sea from the LST, or you could do the same from the LST onto an LCT as well, landing craft tank. And it just meant you could keep the LST, which is so valuable and quite large and vulnerable, out of a bit further out to sea, and then the Rhino ferry would come in. Tension is landing barges. They often get overlooked and neglected, really. And what they were, or most of them were converted river barges, civilian river barges that had sometimes, if they were some were fitted out to carry vehicles, and they were then fitted with a ramp. So they were not designed for use in the assault, because they were, if you think of a river barge, they were quite simple and not particularly strongly designed craft from an amphibious landing point of view. But they generally went over either late on D-Day or on the successive days after that, and they remained off Normandy, helping unload ships that couldn't go right into the beach. So they would go out to ships a few miles off the coast. Vehicles could be craned into them, and then the landing barges would take them the last way into the beach. So that's not every single type. That's a kind of cross section of I think the main types probably.
So Andrew, you've written a book that I've got to say is encyclopedic in its coverage. And so any questions, because we're getting a lot of kind of questions about sort of the minutia of some of these craft, please check out the book, because it is all in there. But despite all of the technical data in the book, I mean, you could turn this whole thing into just a big alphabet soup. One of the things that you also do very, very well is you talk about the crews of these ships, because again, I think that even in terms of naval stories, they get written out of it. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about where are they finding people to sail these things? Because remember, at least I know in the American Navy, we're building the two ocean navy, and Admiral King he wants battleships and aircraft carriers and cruisers, and he's putting sailors on those things. So where are the crews for these craft that have never been built before coming from, and who's training them?
Yeah, finding the crews or the individual crewmen is almost as tricky a job as actually building the landing craft. And there's lots of stages, certainly on the British side, but probably on the American side as well, where the Navy is having trouble finding enough personnel to operate these landing craft, and also to we shouldn't forget also the various bases on shore bases that were needed for training and supplying and supporting the landing craft. And so one way around this is that one solution that's found is that in the US, for example, the US Coast Guard operate a number of landing craft, and also some of the troop carrying ships, as well as the US Navy. And on the British side, the Royal Marines man quite a number of landing craft, as well as the Royal Navy. And then I mentioned the Canadians as well. So the Royal Canadian Navy are playing an important role as well. And so the Royal Canadian Navy landing craft crews are essentially supplementing the Royal Navy landing craft crews, but and generally they have their own flotillas, own groups of landing craft that are specifically Canadian or own ships. So it is quite a headache and does take quite a lot of effort. But I think just looking at the numbers are that just over a third of Allied personnel that are involved, Allied naval personnel that are involved in Operation Neptune in the landings and the operations for the rest of June. Just over 1/3 of Allied naval personnel are crews of landing craft and landing ships. That's including the big troop carrying ships, the LSTs, as well as the landing craft that obviously had fewer numbers of crew. So it's a substantial number of personnel that needed.
One of the things that I always mention to people, and it comes up in your book as well, is that there is a real mixture, allied nature to the landing craft crew. For example, the landing craft that embarked the first wave of the 116th Regiment at Dog Green Sector on Omaha Beach, the Bedford Boys, etc., were all British landing craft under the command of Jimmy Green. There are other examples in your book of sort of cross nationalities there. Was that simply a matter of the way it worked out in the plan, or was there an intentional desire to mix it up a bit?
I think that's just the way it worked out. Sometimes it would be that certain nationalities had either only a certain nationality operated a certain type of craft, or at least that certain nationalities had more of that type of craft available. And for example, just looking at those, so as I said, there were 4 different marks of different types of LCT that were, in the main at least, that were involved on D-Day. So they all had different characteristics, you could say. So not just the different capacity for how many vehicles or other forces they could hold, but also things like the gradient of the beach that they could operate on. So it meant that a British LCT wasn't directly exchangeable for one-to-one for a US LCT, which isn't to say that one was better or worse than the other. It was just that some of those LCTs were better suited for certain jobs, others were better suited for. So, for example, beaching early on D-Day, you wanted a craft that could had no trouble with a shallow sloping beach, because that's what the beaches in Normandy were.
So Andrew, let's kind of get into the sort of the weeds of this now. Obviously we can't cover it all in the time we have left, but let's take a rifleman. You pick the beach, and you walk us through the process of getting him from the ship that took him across the channel to the beach. What all is involved, and what are the steps that these ships are carrying out?
If we're talking about one of the bigger landing ships, so they would have obviously loaded somewhere in the UK, generally along the south coast, and then sailed for Normandy. And as people are probably familiar, there was a route that wasn't in a direct line, but generally the convoys were all taking a route that sort of lined them up with the mine swept channels that were heading for the beaches. And then as that ship got close to the beaches, the distance varied, so it was less, maybe more like 7 or 8 miles off the British beaches, and up to 11 or a bit more miles off the American beaches. The greater distance between being about concerns about German naval guns on the coast. At that point, that larger landing ship would have anchored. Then the troops had to get from the larger ship into the smaller landing craft, and depending on the characteristics of the landing craft and the ship, they could either simply conveniently step from the ship's deck into the landing craft, and then it would be lowered into the water lowered into the water. So that was obviously a much preferable method than the other option, which was where the empty landing craft would be lowered into the water, and then the troops would climb down a scrambling net, netting basically down the ship's side, they'd look down below them, and there'd be this landing craft bouncing up and down in the waves, and they had to time it very carefully to get to jump off the rope netting into the landing craft. Either way, by the time they'd got then they didn't head straight for the beach generally. They'd have been circling around until their particular group of landing craft were all ready. So that, it was a bit of extra time. And then they'd head for the beach. So these small landing craft aren't particularly fast. So they'd be sort of chugging along. So it could be in total several hours from embarking onto the landing craft till they hit to the beach. During that time, because the weather on D-Day wasn't great, the seas were quite rough, so the troops on board were probably being showered with spray, so were probably quite wet by that point, and they'd have had all the noise of all the things like the preparatory gunfire and sometimes the German return fire going on around them, and then depending on the exact timings, and it varied on different beaches, and the details in the book, but as people probably know, the Germans have put obstacles on the beaches for the very purpose of sinking landing craft as they came in, and the Allies had timed it so that the idea was that the first landing craft would arrive at the beach before most of those obstacles were covered, so leaving them high and dry, and in theory, Allied personnel could start destroying them and clearing lanes through those obstacles. To make it much easier for the troops and safer for the troops and the landing craft coming along after that. But in a lot of places, those obstacles aren't cleared, so fairly soon the next waves of landing craft arriving are having to actually try and either find a way through these obstacles, or sometimes they just have to take the decision to, particularly with larger landing craft, to sort of barge through them and hope they manage to not to hit one that explodes and causes too much damage. And actually, in quite a lot of places, and quite a lot of places, that is what the crews of the landing craft choose to do, is they basically head for the beach and try and miss any obstacles that are remaining. But that's their credit to them, that they're generally trying to deliver the troops to the beach. And occasionally, just while I think of it, slight tangent, but occasionally you hear stories about the troops on board sort of holding landing craft crews at gunpoint and forcing, because the quote cowardly landing craft crew wouldn't deliver them to the beach and so on. That generally, or who's to say exactly what happened in 100% of cases, but that would have been very unusual, and generally the landing craft crews were really dedicated to getting the troops on the beach. And often actually, when the losses to both the craft and the casualties to the crews are often not on the way in, because they've got enough momentum at that point as they're approaching the beach that they can hopefully steer around most of the obstacles. But often it's when they're trying to withdraw from the beach and they haven't got the speed or the momentum to actually sort of weave around these obstacles, that they're quite often end up being thrown onto the obstacles, and often these obstacles are mined or had shells on, etc. So then there'd be explosions, and that could cause heavy losses. And I included this particular painting. So this is titled "The Battle for Fox Beach," and it's by Dwight Shepler from the U.S. Naval History and Heritage Command, where actually quite a lot of these images are from. And this shows part of Omaha Beach, and if you so we've got a destroyer in the foreground firing at the beach, but if you look a bit further in, you can see a whole variety of different landing craft, and essentially and spouts of water where there's German shells falling amongst them. And I put this in really just to kind of make the point about how difficult it was to control a large number of landing craft. And this meant that there had to be quite a detailed plan for the succession of waves that would arrive at the beach and deliver the troops not just in the place that they were meant to, but in the time they were meant to. So a lot of the book is based on records of those plans for the succession of waves. But the flip side of that was that if things didn't go according to plan, it was basically nearly impossible, or at least very difficult, to actually change the plan on the fly. There were sort of so many waves heading for the beach that it would have been very difficult to actually say to certain waves, wait, it's not quite time. They in places, and Omaha Beach being a great example of that, they did try and do a bit of that, or sometimes the commanding officers of particular landing craft had to make the decision that we can't land yet, we're going to hold off. But yeah, there was a bit of a kind of freight train effect where there was this huge number of craft heading for the beach and only a limited amount that could be done to change the plan.
So we're almost at the end of our show here. I first want to say James O'Neill has posted up on YouTube.
I was about to say something.
Excerpts from his father's interview. His father was a landing craft coxswain, I think. There, and James, if you can email that long quote to me, I'll put it up on our Facebook page so that people can really see it after the show is up, and that you can email it to me at rick@plateofpeas.com. I'm pretty easy to find. And I want, before we're done, and we've barely touched on many aspects of the book, which goes into great detail. I wanted to show you a picture that's not in your book. Chris, you might want to look away. So I don't know if you've ever seen this picture of an LCT. I think it's very interesting because this is an inflatable LCT, and it is carrying on it inflatable tanks. And I don't believe these were ever used for deception purposes, but they were tested out at Fort Belvoir in 1942 and 43. Do you know anything about that?
Feel free to say this has no relevance to anything. It's quite all right.
So that's a pretend LCT Mark V, which was one of the one of the American types. So I'm not sure that inflatable Mark Vs would have been used for deception for D-Day. I could be wrong, but don't think I've come across them. But
I'm not aware of it actually being used. I think it was tested.
But there certainly were similar mock-ups of British landing craft that were used in various places, basically in the very southeast corner of England as part of the deception plan. Because where there were LCTs, there were presumably going to be the troops nearby who were going to load onto them.
Okay, Chris, did you want to have the final word? You can.
Could I?
Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, no,
you started it. You can end it. You can.
Well, no, this is a question actually from one of our guests because we've talked just very briefly about this vast fleet, right? 4,000 plus ships that are created for this purpose. We've landed. Job is done. What happens to this creation afterwards? Where's it go? What happens to these ships?
Yeah, so I could say read the book and find out.
Well, we could do that too. Yeah, very well put, sir.
But it's very much not the end of the story because the landing craft are used for months afterwards. So their job is very much not over at the end of D-Day. In fact, there are many landing craft and barges and so on that haven't even got to Normandy yet because they're part of that initial loading of troops. But they haven't. But the actual first set of landings carried on until the day after D-Day, and sometimes a day or two later. And can I just, before we go, just mention one thing, which is my website, which is ddaylandingcraft.net. So if people are interested, there's a kind of flavour of what's on the book, plus some other information, including a roll of honour of landing craft and landing ship crew who were killed in the Battle of Normandy. Which, to cut a long story short, didn't quite often they're not actually identified as landing craft crews for various reasons. So that was one thing that came out from my research that couldn't go in the book, but I put it on the website as well. So it's ddaylandingcraft.net with no punctuation or no hyphens or anything like that.
Is that it? Did I get it right?
Perfect. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's the website that you can go to find out more. And of course, you can also check out Andrew's book, which is called D-Day, Landing Craft. Andrew Whitmarsh, thank you so much for joining us and chatting about this amazing topic today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Andrew. And really, guys, check out the book. It's staggering in its detail, and any questions you have about.
Yeah, and if there's something you want to look up, like you want to say, I want to know what the Thomas Jefferson was involved with, or I want to know what time did the tanks land on Dog Green before or after the troops landed? It's all in there.
Yeah, really check it out, and also some really great accounts from the guys that were the crews of these ships, and we shouldn't forget that they're actually human beings driving these things around. So definitely check out the book.
All right, Andrew, thank you so much.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, and next week,
what are we talking about?
D-Day.
I'm shocked, I say.
Next week, we're going to have on Garrett Graff, who's the author of When the Sea Came Alive, an oral history of D-Day, which I believe is a compendium of different first-person accounts, trying to tell the story of what happened that day. So we'll be chatting with Garrett next week and continuing our D-Day topic. But I will be in London, although I won't be in Windsor.
Thank you very much. Yeah, because you can't be bothered to come out and visit. Come all this way and then just drive right by.
You can come in and visit me if you want to. It's fine. I come 3,000 miles and I have to go the last 10. Oh.
Yeah, I mean, how much more is it? You're already coming all the way.
It's
fine. Anyway, moving on.
Guys, please subscribe to us on YouTube. Follow us on Facebook. Shout at us on Blue Sky. Listen to our podcast, back us on Patreon, and browse historyhappyhour.com.
Thanks, everybody. Be safe.
Oh, I pushed the wrong button.
Again. No bell, no button.
No, it's a disaster.